Hey buddy, what's up? Now, if you'll indulge me for an undisclosed amount of time, I'd like to talk about the Nintendo Switch 2. Seeing as how it's been out for a few months now, and I've had enough time to really formulate how I feel about the console itself, I'd like to talk about it, and also talk about kinda where I see the industry as a whole going in the near future. So, grab some snacks, maybe grab a drink or two, and sit back and enjoy my rambling yapping about the little console that may or may not have switched up the industry. Okay, so starting off, the Nintendo Switch 2 in itself, launch night was interesting. When the Switch 2 was announced, I was very, very excited. I'm always a Nintendo kid at heart. Whenever a new system gets announced by Nintendo, I always get super excited. But leading up to launch and launch night, that excitement quickly dissipated. Once I set up the console and got everything working, aside from the new Joy-Cons, it felt like just my Switch, but slightly bigger. And I'm one of the types of guys that use those third-party Switch controllers, and so honestly, it didn't feel that much bigger than my normal Switch. Now, for some context, at launch, I decided to forego getting Mario Kart just because I don't agree with the personal price, and I also just don't play Mario Kart a lot. I don't have a lot of friends that enjoy Mario Kart, or family members that often want to play it. And so I just decided, you know what, I'll save that money and put it towards something I actually care about, which was Cyberpunk. Since Cyberpunk was the other big mainline title that was actually taking advantage of the Switch 2's hardware. And I will say, it is still wild to me that such a not really small handheld anymore, but nonetheless, something that I can throw in a bag can still play Cyberpunk 2077 and play it well. However, I do have to agree with a lot of people's sentiment that the Switch 2 doesn't feel that special anymore. Since the Switch 1's launch, we've seen several PC handhelds come out. I myself have a Steam Deck, and I love that little thing, even though most of the time it spends a lot of its life plugged into a monitor. We've also seen vastly more powerful handhelds come out as well. Especially with the rise in price, it just doesn't feel as special, especially when you can buy a handheld PC for either cheaper or a little bit more money. Now, that's not to say that you're comparing apples to apples here. A handheld PC is, in itself, a lot different from the Switch 2. I would argue that you can't really get comparable performance and specs in a handheld PC that you can on the Switch 2, especially for the price. What I am saying, though, is that the market is a lot more crowded, and Nintendo is not so special anymore. And that brings me to something that I saw in the Switch 1 to Switch 2 transition. And this also came to effect when the PS4 transitioned to the PS5. I feel like companies as a whole are going to have to start really implementing interesting gimmicks into their consoles for the general consumer to actually want to buy them. Generally, we're not seeing the big bang in terms of graphical fidelity and graphical performance that we have seen since I was a child, going from something like the SNES to the N64, where it truly was mind-blowing to see how much graphics changed over a generation. I feel like we're also seeing generations get longer as well, where used to it was roughly about 5 years, and now we're seeing that extend due to many, many different aspects, such as cost to manufacture, cost to consumer, and just overall diminishing returns in terms of what you can really do with hardware, especially when trying to keep in mind of the price. For instance, we're still seeing PS4 games release in the year 2025. Granted, it does feel like Sony has, for the most part, moved on to the PS5. And in my opinion, I think the shadow of the PS6 looming over us is something to keep in mind. And with the Switch 1 to Switch 2, aside from the new Joy-Cons, there's not really anything that really stands out as a reason to buy the product, at least at launch. And this has been true for every generation. I myself advocate for, if you are not a super duper Nintendo nerd like myself, you probably are good waiting a long while for the Switch 2, especially considering the fact that it's a little hard to get a hold of right now. Honestly, if I hadn't secured a pre-order, I probably wouldn't have bought the Switch 2 at launch, seeing as how the launch lineup really wasn't that spectacular, outside of Cyberpunk 2077 for myself. Now, since the Switch's launch, we've seen games like Donkey Kong Bonanza come out, and a few other games that take advantage of the hardware, and are exclusive to the Nintendo Switch 2. However, a lot of your games are still coming on the Switch 1, and some of them don't even have any enhances for the Switch 2. So one has to beg the question of, is it really worth upgrading? With economic times being what they are, it just feels like, yeah, this would be a great thing to have if it was really worth it. And that's kind of where I stand on consoles in general. Lately, it doesn't feel like there's really any reason to buy any console at launch. Granted, this has always been the case, I would argue. Recently, it feels like it's become more and more visible. From lack of games, paying to be a glorified beta tester, and buggy performance, it just feels like, from the consumer side of things, there really isn't a reason to pony up the money when, more likely than not, hopefully, the console will drop in price over time, or, at the very least, a revised version will come out with either better specs or better hardware. Speaking of bugs, one thing that I have encountered that has been a very big pain point for me, and granted, I cannot confirm nor deny that this may be my Switch, or it could be the SD card inside it. However, at launch night, I decided to pick up a 256 gig micro SD card express with the Nintendo branding on it and everything from SanDisk. Once I inserted that bad boy into my console, everything was fine for the first 3 weeks. And then I noticed something strange. Anytime I tried to launch a game, it would error out. There would be no way for me to launch it. Even cartridge games would not launch. And that's when the sinking pit in my stomach developed. I thought, oh great, I have got a lemon. My Switch 2 worked great for the first few weeks, and now it is going to be a paperweight. And I'll have to send it in to Nintendo in the hopes that maybe they can fix it. Now, after doing extensive amounts of testing, basically just plugging the thing all over the place, taking out things, putting it back in, turning it off, turning it back on, I finally discovered that it might be the SD card that's the problem. See, anytime I want to play any game, I have to essentially re-download it onto the system, and then it works flawlessly. However, the minute I want to switch to another game, the game I'm currently playing will run fine, but the game that I want to play will not open. So then I have to delete it and re-download it every time. Now, the re-downloaded game will start up fantastically. But then I run into the same problem, where if I want to play the previous game that I was just playing and was running just fine, suddenly it no longer works. Now, I have chalked that up to most likely it's the SD card that's the issue. Micro SD express cards are a relatively new thing, and honestly, I would replace it. However, currently it is very hard to come by a micro SD express card. And honestly, I'd rather wait and hope that the technology gets better and I can get a bigger SD card. As someone that owns over 100 Switch 1 games, I have no doubt that I will quickly fill up 256 gigs. So I would like something a little bigger. For the Switch 2, that I have a feeling will be in my life for quite some time. Okay, so we're gonna hit the pause button real quick. So while I was editing this video, I'm not sure if an update came out or if this magically fixed itself. Again, I really can't test if this is fixed or if I did something that broke it in the first place or what. However, since August 20th, give or take, I have not been able to recreate, nor have I encountered, the issue that I was having with my Nintendo Switch. Again, I can't tell if maybe Nintendo pushed an update, maybe it was just a weird speck of dust that was on the SD card, I don't know. I honestly have no idea why I have such terrible luck when breaking games and breaking hardware, but I do. And now it's just magically fixed itself, at least for now. But it was still a major pain point for like the first 2-3 months of the Switch's release, and I just decided to keep that part in the video. However, again, it hasn't popped its head up again since, so I don't know. Maybe I'm just incredibly unlucky. But speaking of games, how is everything running? Is the Switch 2 really the beefy powerhouse that Nintendo claims it to be? Well, yes and no. I haven't run into many bugs or any serious crashes outside of my SD card woes, and in general, everything runs fairly well, especially considering the fact that it's, again, a console that I can fit in a bag. I will say I have run into some weird visual oddities when running something like Cyberpunk 2077, where everything kind of gets all smeary and weird, but the fact that it runs, and honestly I haven't seen many dips at all, even in handheld mode, is something to be praised. Now, playing Nintendo first-party games such as Donkey Kong Bonanza has been a flawless experience. Granted, there are some slowdowns here and there, but the fact that the game is running and there are so many things going on under the hood and on screen, it's something that you can kind of just deal with. At least personally, myself, as someone that would rather have a solid frame rate over high-fidelity graphics, I wish that Nintendo would fix some of these frame hiccups that we see, but it's honestly something that's not that big a deal in the grand scheme of things. Now, another sore point for Nintendo is the fact that the Switch 2 does not have a lot of games. And this is not something that has been really unique to Nintendo. I recall on the PS5 at launch, there really didn't feel like there were many games that took advantage of the system, or that released exclusively for the PS5 within its first year. And it feels like Nintendo is in a similar boat. At the time of this recording, Drag X Drive just came out, and it's kind of a wet paper bag. Not a lot of content, and honestly, I see that game going the way of the dinosaur rather quickly. And that was one of the big games that took advantage of the Switch 2's hardware. I suppose one could argue that if Nintendo had made a unique Joy-Con peripheral, it could run on the Switch 1. However, I would counter that by saying Donkey Kong Bonanza probably would not have ran well at all on the Switch 1. It truly is a showcase piece for what the hardware can do. But as of this recording, there are not a lot of games that are utilizing a lot of its gimmicks and hardware features. And, I mean, when you look at something like the PS5, how many games are actually using the DualSense 5's fancy mechanics and different haptics? This is something that I feel like devs in general, aren't taking advantage of. Or they may just not be making games that utilize those features. And that's another reason I feel like Nintendo is falling behind in terms of game releases. Supposedly, Nintendo did not release dev kits for developers to utilize the Switch 2's hardware until after the console's launch. This set back many developers, and we're seeing games not utilize the system's unique features. For instance, I feel like the Switch 2 is a perfect console for games such as Peak, or Repo, or Lethal Company. However, due to the fact that those devs probably don't have a dev kit to develop on the Switch 2, those games are being left behind. Thus, Nintendo is being left behind. As we see many games pop up on platforms such as Steam, we see consoles being flooded with copycats, showcasing that there is a market for these multiplayer, quote-unquote, friend slop games on the consoles. But it feels like developers aren't being given the resources to release on those platforms simultaneously on Steam. Now, I can't recall what the game's title is, however, we are getting a release of a quote-unquote friend slop game. We'll pop the title up right here. Now, this game seems like a perfect showcase for Nintendo's other major achievement with the Switch 2, which is glorified Discord. Now, I won't argue that this is not a cool feature, it's just something I will probably never use. However, I do agree that it probably is something that I feel like a lot of people might get some use out of, especially those that don't use Discord or just want to have a on-console experience with their friends. But here's the thing, this game has characters that would be perfect for Nintendo's other peripheral, the camera. Think about it, you could sit there and plop your face right on the avatar, and then get actual real-life showcases of your terrified face as a monster munches down on you. Or you just barely escape getting out alive with all that glorious footage for BooTube. However, that is not the case. There is no camera implementation at all, at least as of yet. I could see someone argue that mayhaps the handheld's hardware is the limitation for this feature. I'm not a developer, so I can't really say the technical side of if that could be implemented down the line, or if it could be implemented at all due to system limitations. I feel like with Nintendo's big push for multiplayer experiences, using their new chat feature, and hopefully subscribing to Nintendo's online infrastructure, the Nintendo Switch 2 would be a perfect home for games such as Peak, Repo, or Lethal Company, along with many, many others. For Pete's sake, while Nintendo's eShop is getting slightly better in terms of slop and overall general shovelware, it's still a pain to try and navigate. However, this can be argued with every gaming storefront, and honestly, it's just sad to see. And I feel like that's just my general thoughts on the Switch 2. It's a wonderful little machine, however, it's really just a Switch Plus at the end of the day. The UI is still boring, and there's nothing that really sets it apart outside of its outer looks, and some improved hardware under the hood. Gone are the days of Nintendo's whimsy being implemented in every single little nook and cranny of a system. For those of you that were born in the 3DS era, you know what I'm talking about in terms of themes and whimsical animations and icons. Now it's all sterile and, if I'm being honest, boring. But what do I know? The Switch 2 has been selling like hotcakes, and is doing relatively well considering the economic climate that it is launched in. And I myself even bought one. So they must be doing something right. Despite my grumbling, it's still a wonderful little machine, and something that will sell. Nintendo feels like it is going the way of the Pokemon Company, where they don't really need to try anymore, at least in terms of hardware. We'll just keep buying it. Truly, I hope the Switch 2 does succeed. I do hope that Nintendo takes the new and improved hardware and new and improved software that it can make, and make something truly phenomenal. But I fear Nintendo is also getting to the point where they're resting on their laurels. And if in the future we see a Switch 3, I fear that there will not be enough to really grab users. And depending on its price, we may see a considerable dip in its player population. But here's hoping the Switch 2 can be all that the Switch 1 was, and more. I truly love my Switch, and I will keep playing it. It is genuinely my main console of choice right now. Outside of my grumblings, and my viewing of the console's shortcomings, and my overall souring of Nintendo as a whole of recent years, I still love my Switch, and I still love Nintendo. I truly hope that they can make something fantastic, and make some wonderful, wonderful games along the way. I'd like to see Nintendo be ambitious again, and really push the envelope forward, at least at launch. From what I see of the Switch 2, I see them playing it safe, implementing what is a glorified chat feature, and some interesting magnetic Joy-Cons do not detract from the fact that the Switch 2 is just a Switch Plus, relying heavily on the Switch 1's gigantic library, while offering very little in terms of exclusive games that are tailor-made for the console. This will change over time, however, but the question is, will it be enough? Only time will tell. But I hope you enjoyed this little rambling yapathon. How are your feelings on the Switch 2? Did you pick one up at launch? What are you playing on it? Or, if you're not playing on a Switch 2, what are you playing on? And are you enjoying the games on it? Let me know down below. Until next time, guys, I hope you enjoyed and hope you have a fantastic day. I've been your guide into the unknown, Will-o-Wisp. If you'd like to check out my channel, then hey, hit that little subscribe button and ring-a-ding-ding that bell. in the hopes that maybe YouTube might just let you know whenever I upload. But until next time, guys, I will catch you on the flip side. Bye-bye!